I will turn the program over to Jason Scorza, who can introduce our guest.
Thank you very much, Diana. And we are greatly honored to have with us today Assistant Secretary General Elliott Harris, who is based in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the UN. Mr. Harris also serves as Chief Economist for the United Nations. And I, for one, am certainly looking forward to discussing his experience and his insights in both of those two roles. And Mr. Harris, if you don't mind, I'm going to start you off with a really, really easy question, which is this. What is the state of the world economy right now? A lot of people are nervous and upset about inflation. They're concerned about supply chains. Is it much ado about nothing, or is there something that we really need to be concerned about?
Oh, well, thank you very much, Jason. Thank you for the invitation as well. The world economy is in a strange place. I think we are, in some parts of the world, in recovery mode. We're coming back from the shock of the crisis. You think about the US, you think of China. The European Union is increasingly doing well. But as you said, there are still difficulties. The supply chains have been a rising problem. And there is that concern that pent-up demand may be part of the reason for a prolonged spout of rising prices. But by the same token, this is a very uneven recovery. Unevenness, I think, has been the hallmark of this entire crisis. There are some countries that haven't even begun the process of recovering. And there are two main reasons for that. Some of them are still not in a position to start any kind of comprehensive vaccination program. So without the vaccinations, the ability to reopen fully is constrained. And secondly, many countries were not in a position to put in place stimulus packages at the time, support measures, and they are still not in a place to be able to support a robust recovery. And so we have this two-tier or three-tier economic performance globally that is increasingly generating very differentiated impacts even within countries. And we still have rising uncertainties and heightened risks where we know climate change is still out there, biodiversity is out there, and in many cases our ability to deal with those crises have been sort of sidetracked by the present overwhelming crisis of COVID. We have debt that has risen in many countries to really distressing levels. And we have the uncertainties and the tensions of global trade, as we said, with the global supply chains as a problem, but the fact that, well, we don't quite know what the reforms of the global trading system are going to look like over time. So there's still a very large question mark behind this recovery, and it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Is the data showing that the countries that were previously less well off are becoming, falling, I should say, even further behind? Or is it not that simple?
Oh, I think there's no doubt about that, because the countries that were less well off to begin with are the ones that were less in a position, as I said earlier, to put in place support measures. And that means that the impact of the crisis was deeper, structurally deeper for them. And some of the impacts are going to be very, very long lasting indeed. We may find permanent damage to the structures of many economies. Many enterprises that have closed down in developing countries are not going to come back. Many jobs have been lost forever. And these are things that are going to be very difficult for them to deal with, in part because they lack the fiscal space to compensate, to kickstart a recovery, to spur on the private investment that's needed. And so, yes, we will have a disproportionate impact on certain sectors, for example, in the hospitality industry, that are public facing, in certain countries that depend on these sectors, when you think about some of the Caribbean islands and their tourism, and in certain countries that still haven't even begun really the process of vaccinating their citizens to provide some sort of protection so that economic activity can start in full force. And again, many countries lack fiscal space and so will not be able to support a robust recovery unless things change on the global scene.
Is investment in economic recovery part of the mandate of the United Nations through World Bank or IMF or other entities?
Again, it depends on what you mean by investment in the economic recovery. A large part of that preparation for the recovery might very well be stabilizing the public finances, in which case I think the IMF has played throughout the crisis a very important role and continues to do so. But there's a tremendous amount of other investment that has to happen that couldn't be handled by the IMF, investment in the sustainable infrastructure that we're going to need, investments in some of the digital literacy skills, some of the digital infrastructure that we're going to need for countries to be able to bridge that digital divide and take advantage of the new technologies that are available. And in many respects, I think there is still a long way to go to deal with this question of, well, how do we handle the differentiated impact that the COVID-19 crisis has had on societies and on countries? Because, as I said, it's been an uneven crisis from the very beginning, and there are many countries that are still suffering not only from the impact of the crisis, but from the fault lines that have been particularly exposed. If you're on the wrong side of the digital divide, and we've seen that process of digitalization deeply accelerated by COVID as we moved online in reaction to the shutdowns, well, then you are going to fall farther and farther behind unless you can take really ambitious steps to close that divide. And that is going to be very difficult in cases where governments are very financially constrained and where the private sector is not providing the kind of investment resources that are needed.
I see that you're wearing the brilliant multicolor lapel pin of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. What are you hearing and what are you seeing with reference to sort of global commitment to those goals? Is there a less enthusiasm, as much enthusiasm? Is the pandemic being sort of cited as a reason not to accelerate efforts toward the goals?
No, I don't think it's that simple. We were off track with regard to the Sustainable Development Goals before the crisis hit. Yeah, and there's no doubt about that. And we were off track, I think, for two reasons. One, we didn't have enough investment in sustainable activities. And very many observers have said, well, that's because the money didn't flow in the right way from the rich countries to the poor countries. I think that's quite beside the point. I think there's more than enough money available in the private economy to pay for whatever investments needed around the entire world. But there are several problems with that. One is that for private money to flow, there has to be a value proposition. There has to be an investment that makes sense. It has to be bankable, and it has to be at a reasonable scale. And that has always been a problem in developing countries, putting forward bankable projects at scale, at a sufficient scale to attract the large-scale private finance. Let's be very clear on this. We're talking about investing up to $3.5 to $4 trillion a year in developing countries, and another $3 trillion in the developed world. You cannot possibly invest that volume of money in small-scale projects. It just won't happen. It has to be going out of the door in massive quantities, and that is a big problem, that scale. The second problem behind all of that is uncertainty and risk are the worst enemy of investment. And we have public policies that are simply not firmly consistent with the Sustainable Development Agenda. Governments signed on to the agenda in 2015, but their policies haven't kept pace with those commitments. We see that very, very clearly in the climate agenda. They signed on to the Paris Agreement in 2015. The policies are nowhere near commensurate with those commitments under Paris. And what that does is send a mixed signal to the potential private investor. What is going to be the direction of public policy next year or in 5 years' time? And because the track record hasn't been as firmly committed towards the SDGs, as consistent with the SDGs as it should have been, there's this big question mark behind public policy and therefore a heightened perception of risk and uncertainty. That is what is holding back private investment. Without the private investment, we're not going to mobilize as much money as is needed. And the Sustainable Development Agenda, which depends on investments in these new and more sustainable activities, well, it will not proceed as fast as it should. And that, I think, is the problem. Now, the crisis, in many respects, is a bit of an opportunity. All types of investments have declined in the initial phase with the shock of the crisis. But as we start thinking about recovery, we can actually make changes that we fail to make for political reasons. In the past, I think there was a lot of hesitancy to take the decisive step to make the ambitious decision for fear of pushback, for fear that people will focus on a trade-off. Well, what we've seen in COVID is that governments all around the world have been able to take extraordinarily ambitious measures because the stakes were high. It was that or everything falls apart and melts down. We need to see the same kind of ability to take decisive and ambitious measures put into play in making the decisions and taking the policy steps that are needed for the recovery to become a return to sustainable development. We've seen that we can do it when the stakes are high enough. Well, the stakes are pretty high still. And I think we need to really insist that our political leaders step up to the plate and do what they've shown they can do in a crisis situation, even as we start to move out of that crisis.
Yeah, you've mentioned politics, and we were going to get there inevitably, because so much of I think so much of the resistance to aggressive, ambitious sustainability initiatives come from domestic policy and political challenges. In my own country, obviously, the coal industry, the oil industry, tremendously powerful, tremendously influential, very hard to get the kinds of initiatives done on the political level. What's interesting is that some of the major developments, the major commitments, what we might consider to be the ambitious commitments, are coming from the private sector. Ford Motors, for instance, seems to be serious about making its entire fleet electric, not in the super remote future, but in the foreseeable future. They're also taking steps such as building their new plants in the states that have been most opposed to renewable energy efforts, which is not an accident. Is there similar things going on in other parts of the world, or is this sort of a special United States problem where we need to work around sort of embedded interests, or at least perceptions of embedded interests?
I'm hesitant to comment on domestic policy per se. Of course, somebody in my position has a difficult time of doing that. But let us say that we see all around the world a recognition that we cannot continue the way we have done in the past. Now, I'm not surprised. You yourself mentioned, Professor, that it's the private sector that's taking the lead in many respects, because again, anybody who intends to be making a profit 5 years from now has to be thinking about what the situation is going to look like 5 years from now. And 30 years from now, if we see the prospect of global warming melting down everything and sea levels rising in New York and drowning half of lower Manhattan, that becomes a problem for doing business. It's not surprising at all that they take this seriously and look to find ways in which they can adapt their own operations to be consistent with a sustainable future in which they can continue to make profits. There is absolutely no contradiction between healthy chasing after profits and sustainable activities. You just do it in sustainable ways. That is, I think, the problem of policy. It is that short-termism that allows politicians to only look to the next election in a way that corporate leaders, that luxury they don't have. They have to look past the next quarter. At least they've learned how to do that. Now, what we've seen happening more and more is that the financial industry is driving a lot of that change. The financial industry, I always take every opportunity to mention this anecdote. When Hurricane Andrew hit Florida and caused about, I think it was between $9 and $12 billion of damage, it caused a real problem for many of the world's largest reinsurance companies, because they were exposed and nobody had expected the damage of that nature. They learned how to deal with that. They learned how to approximate the risk and to provision against it, so that when Hurricane Sandy hit a decade later and generated 6 times the amount of damage, the impact on the insurance industry was minimal. They had provisioned for it. That is what we see happening more and more in the financial sector. They realize that things like climate change, environmental degradation, the loss of natural capital overall does have an impact on the bottom line, and they have to plan around that. That's a risk that has to be managed. That awareness has not yet seeped into public policy to the same extent. In other countries where you have a national debate around some of these issues, where you have political parties that have a consistent platform, you can have that kind of consistent policy making over a longer term framework. But it is something where the private sector is well ahead of the public sector in most countries around the world. And I think that is a wake-up call for public politicians. I think they will find, if they've finally decided to take ambitious steps, that there'd be a lot less pushback and a lot less resistance than they actually think.
Some people would say that, well, I would say that economics as a discipline, as a worldview, inherently discounts the future, because the more remote the future circumstances are, the less certain they are. Therefore, the less emphasis they receive in models. Short-termism, of course, is exacerbated by the political structures of our leading democracies, which have elections every year, and important elections every 2 years. How do we get over it? I mean, I understand the political challenges perhaps better, because that's my discipline. How do you build economic models that factor in the possibility of pandemics, the possibility of severe climate events, that factor in world historical climate events?
Well, I think we have a double-edged sword here. On the one hand, I mean, what you're describing there is the kind of scenario analysis and stress tests that the financial industry has become quite proficient at. But those are not economic models. Those are financial models. And there's a fundamental difference. The problem that we have in economics is that all of our economics, I think, is articulated around the concept of GDP. That's what we consider to be the measure of progress, the value that we accumulate and generate through our economic activities. GDP is a snapshot at a point in time. It generates it measures the flow of value created in the course of a period, but it says absolutely nothing about how that value was created. So it could be that we've generated value by burning fossil fuels, or using up exhaustible natural resources, poisoning our air and our waterways, and so on and so forth, which is what we've done for decades. In GDP, completely agnostic about that, doesn't care, cannot be featured in GDP. One of the very first things I learned as a very young economist in the first year of university was the concept of externalities, that there are certain things that don't have a market price, and so consequently they don't feature in economic calculations. Well, that is because of the way we measure our progress. It's because of what we count in GDP. Now, what the consequence of all of that is that we can merrily go along generating what we think is value while undermining the basis for future value generation. We poison our atmosphere, and that, of course, is going to be a problem down the road. We warm our climate, and it's a problem today. But if we could change the way we measure what we are doing, then we would change the way in which we manage it. Yeah, and that is what has to happen. We have GDP, the system of national accounts, which doesn't take into account the environmental dimension. It doesn't take into account the social dimension. There's nothing in the gross domestic product that speaks to the quality of the education of our children, or the level of healthcare that we have. In other words, the investments that we make in our human capital, which we know, I mean, is all about us. And yet we're not measuring how well we're doing in promoting us. We poison our atmosphere, and of course that affects the humans who live in it. When we move to a position where we measure all of that, then our economic models will change. They have to change, because we will no longer be able to ignore the externalities. Now, we've taken a major step towards that. This year, the UN Statistical Commission adopted the system of ecosystem accounting, which allows for a universal and accepted methodology to value natural capital, which is the first step. And that will be integrated into the system of national accounts. And that means then that we will be able to measure not just the generation of value through economic activities, but also the change in the stock of natural capital, the diminution of our stock of trees, forests, the quality of our water, and all of that we'll be able to assign a value to and measure. We have to do the same thing in the social dimension. And then at some point, hopefully in the near future, we'll come to a measurement of our activities that gives us not only a sense of the current value and market prices that we've generated, but also what we've done to the underpinnings of that future prosperity, to our human capital and to our natural capital. Once that is all integrated into the measurement system, then we will have something that's commensurate with our sustainable development aspirations.
Pulling back a little bit to say back to the pandemic, and perhaps this is relevant to having a more pluralistic approach to understanding progress. A lot of commentators, when they were talking about the pandemic and its impact, were speaking as if public health was one thing, economics were another thing, and that these two things were in opposition to each other. That the choice was, you quote unquote open the economy. Yes, you're going to pay a price in illness and death, or you can quote unquote keep the economy closed and save lives. That struck me as a false choice, still strikes me as a false choice. But how do we overcome the perception that it's a false choice in our discourse?
I'm going to start from the very simple assumption that sick people can't work. If you're dead, it doesn't matter if you have a job or not. Now, we were confronting a public health crisis without any kind of parallel. The closest we would have come to that would have been the Spanish flu back, 100 years ago. And we had the science to understand how this thing was transmitting itself. And we had the public health expertise that said, in the absence of a vaccine, we have to block the transmission. So I thought that, that was asking the wrong question, saying we have to either open it up, take our risks with health so that our economy could work, or we have to shut down the economy. No, I think it was a question of getting on top of that virus first and foremost. Because as long as the virus is there, people will be getting sick at tremendous cost to the economy, at tremendous cost in terms of lives lost as well. And until we had a vaccine in hand, there was nothing else to be done about it. So framing the debate in terms of either we earn money or we sit at home and are safe, that was the wrong kind of debate. The debate was about getting on top of the virus before it got on top of us. And lacking the tools of a vaccine, that was what we had to do from a pandemic perspective. Now, what we found here is that since we now have a vaccine, we can envisage a different way of dealing with this. Now, it's not to say that we can all vaccinate ourselves and everybody's happy and it's no longer a problem, because, well, as long as there are large numbers of people that are still not vaccinated in the world, there's always going to be the danger of a surge. There's always going to be the danger of mutations. And at some point, a mutation is going to come by that is immune to the vaccine, let's put it that way, So this is a public health issue that is still out there. But with the vaccine and with the ways in which we've learned to live and work around the virus, we can envisage a different kind of approach to economic activity. It's not the same as it was before. It's restricted in many ways, in manners and ways and means that it wasn't restricted before. But before, we didn't have a virus that was capable of killing 5 million people, which it has done. And so I think this is just a realistic question of understanding how we have to adapt the way we live to this virus until such time as we can actually manage to control it. And we are a long way away from that because we haven't managed to vaccinate everybody yet by a long shot.
I'd like to turn away from economics, which you could probably tell I know next to nothing about, to your broader role as Assistant Secretary General in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. I would imagine that many of our attendees today don't know much about DESA or how extensive its portfolio of issues and activities are. So I wonder if you could sort of put us in the picture.
Okay.
What is DESA? What is its mandate? What is its scope?
The Department of Economic and Social Affairs, DESA, is the part of the United Nations Secretariat that handles the global economic and social policy aspects of the United Nations work. We don't work at the country level. We don't work at the regional level per se. We deal with the global issues. One aspect of that work is producing the macroeconomic projections that the UN system uses as a way of understanding sort of the basis upon which we might create prosperity, how that prosperity is distributed and shared, and what the challenges are looking forward. Perhaps the best way of sort of describing the broad range of our mandates and our work is to look at our structure. We're organized into several divisions. One of them is the Financing for Sustainable Development Office, and that handles all various aspects of official financing flows, aid, if you will, development cooperation. It deals with debt, deals with issues like sort of international cooperation on tax matters, combating illicit financing flows, but it also has the lead agency in something we call the Integrated National Financing Framework, which is one of the frameworks in which we think about how countries can mobilize the resources that they need for their sustainable development strategies. We have the Division of Sustainable Development Goals, which is the division that coordinates the overall UN response to the Sustainable Development Agenda, to the support measures we provide to member states as they try to reach the SDGs. But that division also looks at things like the science, technology, and innovation movement. These are parts of the changes in technology, the innovations that will help us to get to the Sustainable Development Goals. They look at water, they look at energy, they look at oceans, transportation. This is sort of the broader sense of the larger issues that sort of shape our world and the way we act in it. We have the Division of Public Information and Digital Government, and that is it sounds like it would be a sort of a boring division, but they do some riveting stuff. They deal with public administration, and although that sounds a little bit sort of pedestrian, it isn't. It really isn't. Because what we see happening is more and more governments around the world are using digital means to provide government services. And we see it all in our daily lives, that you can actually avoid having to go down to the Department of Motor Vehicles and apply for your renewal of your license online, and so much more that you can do online, government services, and allowing governments now to bring services to people who might otherwise have had difficulty getting them. But that is also the place where the Internet Governance Forum is housed. And that is the world's premier forum for dealing with how we manage and administer the Internet across borders. We have the Division of Inclusive Social Development that deals with social affairs, the vulnerable and marginal groups, persons with disabilities or indigenous peoples, youth. They also deal with issues of social protection, of inequality, the role of sport in peace and development, and they deal with the social side of what our societies are actually aiming for. We have the Economic Affairs and Policy Division, which is where the macroeconomic policy projections are done, but they also do a lot of the thought leadership of the UN on economic matters, and it's where a lot of the economic research happens that the UN system does. It also, however, is the division that is responsible for the least developed countries and for the graduation of these countries into upper income status. We have the UN Forum on Forests, which, as the name indicates, is a place where the world comes together to talk about managing the world's forests. We have the Office of Intergovernmental Support and Coordination, because DESA bears the responsibility of supporting a lot of the intergovernmental processes around economic and social matters with the Economic and Social Council and the various committees of the General Assembly. And we have the last two. One of them is the Statistics Division. And the UN is the undisputed global leader in statistical matters. And the entire world aligns itself around the decisions that the member states take in the Statistical Commission. It is there that the revision of GDP is happening. And the other area is the Population Division, where again, the UN takes the global lead in matters of demographic and migration data and population affairs. And this is where a lot of the the data and the policies around demographic trends are handled. So that's an overview of what DESA does. Now, as I say, we're not active on the ground. We're not one of the resident agencies that is out there in countries supporting the developing country governments and making policies. But we do try to provide the global context, the understanding of what is going on in economic and social policy globally and in different regions, and use that to inform the messages that our colleagues on the ground bring to the member state governments where they work.
And the stakes are quite high, are they not? Statistics may sound pedestrian or even prosaic, but how these models are created has real, I was about to say cash value, but cash value at the ground level. Can you give us one or two examples that can bring that into focus for us?
Well, I think you're quite right. I mean, one would hope that policymakers use the available evidence to inform their decisions. And one of the most important elements that we have, as I said, is GDP. All right. Now, GDP is a statistical concept in basic principle. You know, it comes out of the system of national accounts. It's an accounting principle. But the GDP number is the kind of indicator that policymakers can use. If they think that their policies are being successful, they would expect to see that translate into a stronger performance in terms of GDP. If they see GDP falling short of expectations, they look to see, well, what is different to what we assumed? Do we need to change some of our policies? Do we need to encourage more investment in certain areas and so on? That would be one example. Another example, though, is one that talks to the whole question of the public health situation that we're in. Because right now we understand that there are tremendous strains on the public health system, and we are not sure exactly how well we're doing in protecting people from COVID. But because of the data that we collect on a regular basis in the public health sphere, we are aware of how much our effort with regard to other diseases has fallen down. All right? So we know just by looking at the data that there are far less mammograms being carried out, far less sort of regular examinations for preventive care. There are far more people dying of preventable disease, non-communicable diseases like heart failure and of diabetes. And a large part of that has to do with the fact that so much of our public health system has shifted its concentration, its attention away from dealing with these ongoing health issues to dealing with the pressing crisis of COVID. And so one of the areas where the statistical community, for example, is spending a lot of time and effort is to try to understand the excess deaths. It sounds a morbid concept, but we're trying to understand the excess deaths that are resulting from COVID. People who are dying at a greater rate than they would have died if we hadn't had COVID. And that is how we can measure the impact that COVID has had on public health. And that then informs the ways in which we'll have to adjust our public health system so that we'll be able to deal with a future pandemic in a more consistent and carefully considered way.
And certainly vaccinations are a big part of the answer to that challenge.
Absolutely.
In as much as if you're vaccinated, you may still get sick, but you are much less likely to be using hospital resources.
Exactly.
Which then can be used for other critical care.
Now, another area where we found that having a clear understanding of what is going on, measuring what is going on, allows for more informed, better informed policy is in the area of inequality. Now, we've known for quite some time that the world is becoming more unequal. We've had technology that has been accelerating, digital technologies in particular, and that has polarized job markets. We find people who have the training and the skills to do the work that requires digital technologies, or that the work that is required by digital technologies, they have been able to capture the jobs that pay well. They have been able to earn the higher salaries. But at the same time, the digitalization has led to a certain degree of automation, a certain amount of robotization, and some jobs are being sort of phased out and we're replaced by, if you will, digital means. And so we find that there's a widening of the gap on salaries, a widening of income inequality, and it's articulated in many respects around that digital divide, which is becoming deeper and wider. Now, understanding how that is going on, understanding the extent to which incomes are diverging, understanding which incomes are benefiting, which incomes are losing out, that is critical information for a policymaker if and when that policymaker decides to address the question of income inequality. And that's that's a political problem right there. To what extent are you willing to live with it? Or to what extent are you determined to do something about it? That's a political economy question. It's a social question as well. But in order to do anything about it, you have to know where it's happening and to what degree. And that is where the information becomes critical.
And as always, if you ask the wrong questions, you're not going to get answers that are particularly useful for setting policy. Are there questions that you would like to see DESA ask that it just hasn't gotten to yet, and that would advance its work and agenda?
I think there are two, maybe three areas that I think we need to really spend a lot of time focusing on. One is this issue of moving beyond GDP. We know that we are not measuring everything that's important. And we have to start measuring it in order to be able to manage it. And the first step in doing that is to recognize that GDP has severe limitations. I think we've got there, although that recognition isn't quite as broad and widespread as it needs to become. But now we have to think about what we need to do differently and how we can expand it so that we can start to measure things that are important, not purely economic. They may be social, they may be environmental, but they are critical for us. That would be one. The second thing is I think, far more fundamental. Maybe not. GDP is pretty fundamental, but let's the thing I want to think about is private finance. We've recognized, I think, very clearly that there isn't enough public money in the world to do everything that needs to be done. There is plenty of private money, more than enough for what we need. But we have to change the approach, the paradigm for development. We tend to think still of development as something that is led by governments and done by governments. And I think that tends to leave the private sector a little too far off on the side. And we have to bring the private sector in because when you think about it, it's the private sector that comes up with the technologies and the advances and the innovations that we need. It's the private sector that does most of the investments. It is the private sector that creates the jobs that people depend on. And so I think we need to find a way to get the private sector to be more involved in the whole thinking about the future. What is happening now is we find they are thinking about the future, as I said at the very beginning. I mean, they are indeed preparing for sustainability, but they're doing it on their own, on a separate track. And I think there needs to be a greater sort of harmony between the public policy side and the private sector corporate side, corporate and financial side, so that we can move in the same direction and enhance each other's efforts. And I think that's something that we...
You're implying that Davos is not enough.
I'm sorry, implying what?
You're implying that Davos is not enough.
I think there's a lot that is recognized and explained in Davos that is not translated into changes in policy. It's as simple as that. I mean, we know what needs to change. We just don't have the political gumption to go out there and do it. And I think it's as simple as that. I think we really just have to bite the bullet and say, okay, we know what we need to do. Let us do it. And if we have to take an electoral loss, well, maybe people will come to their senses by the time of the next short-term electoral cycle, and we can come back in and continue. Something along those lines has to happen. So those are two areas that I think are really very, very important. And the third thing, I think we need a really major effort on the biodiversity front. We've done a lot of work on climate. The science is very well established, and we know where the culprit is and we know what to do about it. I don't think we're as well placed on the biodiversity side. And I think part of the problem is that biodiversity is exactly that. It's diverse. From one country to the next, the concept of biodiversity can mean an entirely different thing. Even within one country, from biodiversity in the Californian deserts is very, very different to biodiversity in Appalachia. No? So that makes it difficult to come up with an approach. And I don't think we will be able to do it in an approach. We need to work on several different fronts at the same time, but we need to get started. And I think that is something that there's another conference of parties, under the UN Convention on Biodiversity at the end of this year, and it's really important that we make some progress there as well. So those are the three things I'd like to see more work done, including in DESA.
Diana.
Thank you. That's really wonderful. I'm still processing all of that. There's just so much to take in, but our wonderful audience has started sharing some of their questions. And if ASG Harris, if I may, I'd like to pose a few of the questions to you. First is from Jeremy, who asks, regarding a commitment that I'm not aware of, but perhaps you might be, and others, that Elon Musk has made a commitment of money to address world hunger. And the question asks, will there be a public plan related to that? And what is the planning in place at this point in time to make use of that commitment?
Understand, I'm not a food expert. I've never worked on that, but just recently we had a World Food Summit. And many of the types of issues that are related to world hunger were dealt with there. Our problem is food systems. Now, it's a fact that somewhere between 30 and 40% of all food produced spoils before it gets to the consumer. It is also a fact that we throw away a tremendous amount of food once it has reached the consumers. Right? Now, part of that waste explains the hunger that is still in the world. Right? But even if we were to eradicate all food waste, we'd still have a problem with distributions, because not all food is produced and available there where it is most needed. And I think that is one of the issues that the Food Summit talked about. That food systems needs to be the way we think about hunger, not just in terms of growing more crops or producing more nutrition. It's the whole system of it that isn't really as performant as it needs to be. Now, of course, there are all sorts of plans and strategies that have been devised and have been put in place. But again, one of the problems I think that we have is that these systems are very fragmented. They're fragmented within countries. So even the transition from the rural areas where the food is produced into the urban areas where it's primarily consumed, that distribution system is often fraught with all sorts of difficulties. And a lot of waste happens there between the farm gate and the table. And that's just within one country, far less when we talk about going across different countries, because we have a situation where many countries are net food importers. They can't produce enough food for their own populations. And arranging or coming to an agreement on what an international system should look like that earns the name of a food distribution system, that is a major challenge, because again, it is subject to political decisions as well as technical and logistical decisions that are made in different places under a fragmented system. And so a lot has to be done to rationalize the way all of that is organized. And I think there we can make a tremendous contribution in reducing world hunger, even without having to worry about more production or changing the way in which we produce food.
What you're talking about in large part is post-harvest waste, where you might be growing whatever, mangoes, but the food literally rots in the field or on the truck or in the crate before it can be sold. One strategy that's being looked at to address this is incentivizing value-added production. So in the field, transforming or processing the product before it has a chance to spoil. Is this the sort of research that DESA does, or is that sort of a a global World Food Organization kind of
It is. It is. I mean, that requires a certain expertise, a familiarity with the ways in which food products are produced and the ways in which they're distributed and marketed that go well beyond the expertise that we have in DESA. The Food and Agriculture Organization, International Fund for Agricultural Development, they handle that. The World Food Program is more on the relief side, providing humanitarian assistance. But there is an awful lot of very, very well done research, good studies, and a lot of experience. These are things that have worked in different parts of the world. And it's a question now of making sure that we can scale them up and bring them to bear in all parts of the world to have a global food distribution system or food production system that is actually worthy of the name.
Mm.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. One of our participants has a question about something you addressed in terms of the unequal impact of COVID. But his concern is, how can we help lesser developed countries get on top of COVID and address all of the impacts of it if even the most developed countries are struggling to do it themselves?
That goes well beyond health policy, and in some countries it's a question of addressing the vaccine hesitancy. There is no developed country that is lacking vaccines, so that's not the problem. If people are not taking the vaccination, that there are other issues that have to be addressed, but that in and of itself is quite, in my mind, a bit independent of the availability of vaccines. Whereas in many of the developing countries, it is really a question of the availability of vaccines. And so I think there is a lot that needs to be done to enable countries, developing countries, to get access to the vaccine in sufficient scope to be able to really begin a widespread program of vaccination of their citizens. In some parts of Africa, we have vaccination rates of 2% of the population. And that's totally unacceptable. It provides no protection because so many people are still susceptible to infection. And so that is where I think we can do a lot. We can make sure that vaccines are made available to countries, even if they can't pay the full price themselves. We can provide support, financial support to purchasing the vaccines. We can provide a lot of support on vaccine distribution. We know the developed countries who have been vaccinating their populations now for a good year, they've learned how to do it in the most effective way. And they may not have the same distribution capacities in some developing countries, but we know what works and what doesn't work. And we can bring all of that to bear as well as part of our contribution to helping the developing countries manage the COVID crisis. But I think we should all understand that the longer we wait to get vaccines into the arms of people everywhere in the world, the higher the danger that we will face mutations that are very much more dangerous than what we're dealing with today. And it'll continue until we can put a halt to the transmission. And the only way to really do it, unless we lock everybody into our homes, as we tried to do at the beginning, which we know we can't sustain forever, there is no other way of putting an end to this pandemic than to get people vaccinated. Everybody. And because as long as we have significant shares of the population that are not vaccinated, we always will still have that danger of surges. And with surges come mutations, and with mutations come ineffectiveness of the existing vaccine. That's my view of this thing.
Yeah, certainly a very good point. Thank you very much. Moving towards another area that was discussed in terms of the environment and climate change, one of our participants points to situations that certainly impact our economies, and that is rising water levels and increased flooding. Particularly, we see even within the U.S. And around the world how people are continue to live in flood-prone zones. Yet these are not being addressed by governments. And our participant wants to know, what is the view at the UN of how families, how people on the ground can be helped in this regard when they're not getting the kinds of assistance from their local governments, and addressing sustainability in that regard?
I think the first step is information. People need to know what data exists, what information exists about the flood risk, wherever they are, and in places where they might envisage going. If you have that information, then you can make a more informed choice about whether you stay there or whether you go there. I think that is part of the problem that we face right now, is that governments don't really want to spread that information, because we then find them confronting claims for support to move. If you have somebody who owns a house in a floodplain, and that floodplain is now 40% more at risk of damaging floods, then of course the market value of a home there is significantly less. That person is going to have difficulty selling that home in order to move, right? Especially if the knowledge about the flood risk is broad. If everybody knows about it, this is a problem. Now, what will have to happen at some point is that there'll have to be some sort of a structured program for people to gradually move out of these areas before the flood risks become an eventuality. But there's often a sense that governments have to pay for this. Well, some governments may be in a position to do that. Many governments are not, right? And I think the key point here is to sort of be clear about where the floodplain risks lie, where they're getting more pronounced, so at least people have those who are not yet there have the choice not to go in, and those who are there already know early enough that they can start making plans to move out before the catastrophe hits. But again, you have hundreds of millions of people who live in coastal plains around the world. You think of a country like Bangladesh, which is flat, it's at sea level in the coastal area, and there are literally hundreds of millions of people who live there, for whom this is an existential threat. And these are people who can't count on their government to come and help bail them out and give them money to settle somewhere else. And we're seeing that in rising numbers of climate refugees. And it's happening. It is really happening as we speak, and in all sorts of different areas. And it's not just because of floods. We have people who are leaving drought-prone areas because the droughts are there. They're getting more intense. They're getting longer lasting. And these are things that are going on. And we see in some respects that the lack of information, the lack of a clear policy sometimes exacerbates the problem, because it allows people to make choices about where they live, where they want to buy and build homes. And had they had all the information, they might have considered doing it somewhere else. But they build a home and then confront a pronounced danger of drought or of forest fires or of flooding or whatever it might be. And I think the information deficit here is a real culprit in this game. And we do have to make an effort to get as much information as we can out there so that more informed choices and more informed policies can be made.
Thank you. I think your answer really illustrates what you mentioned earlier about the necessity of valuing natural capital. And that leads us to our next question on the issue of different measurements and revising social measurements. Do you have an idea of how long before these new models will be introduced, those that go beyond just the GDP?
That's again one of those difficult questions. My statisticians tell me it'll be 5 or 6 years. Once we start the process of revising and updating the system of national accounts, it should be 5 or 6 years. Probably because that's how long it took the last time. Yeah. And statisticians are very sort of thorough people, and they do everything and check it 17 times. But I think we don't quite have the luxury of time that we might have had back in the past. We need to have this change happen soon. I can't answer how long it will take. I'm hoping that we can do it within 5 or 6 years. But bear in mind, I mean, we've accepted the ecosystem accounting system, which is one aspect of it. Yeah, we still have to go and establish baselines based on this new methodology. So countries have to go and figure out, okay, what is the value of our stock of of trees? What is the value of our waterways? And using that methodology, they have to establish a baseline as of today or as of whenever they make the count. And then they have to establish indicators that allow us to measure how those values change over time. So there's quite a bit of work that is still to be done. We've made a major step forward with the adoption of the system, but using the system now is going to take some time. And many countries will need to sort of equip themselves to do that. That's on the natural capital side. We still have to do the same thing on the social dimension. Now, every country on Earth collects an awful lot of social data, but they may be collecting the data and measuring it in somewhat different ways. They may not have exactly the same definitions. And we still haven't started figuring out how we integrate the data on ourselves, on us humans, into this system of national accounts. And that might prove to be quite controversial, because, again, are we going to be thinking about things like, how do we assess the quality of our investments in human capital, the healthcare, the education that we provide to our citizens? All of that will build up their human capital, which is what we're aiming for, to figure out what that is. But how do we assess the value of 1 year of secondary education? There are qualitative differences that are very stark, and sometimes they vary dramatically within a relatively small region. Where I sit right now in New York, my child is in a public school here, and the quality of the education he's getting, well, it's like a different country if I were to go 30 miles further south into the northern part of New York City. So all of these are sort of imponderables, intangibles that we have to take into account at some point. But I think the key point is we need to get a start going. We need to really move with all due haste to get past the limitations of our present measurement system. And then I think it'll pick up speed as we go along, and hopefully we'll get there sooner rather than later.
I think you would probably agree that social scientists tend to count things that are easy to count and discount things that are hard to count. Might this be a situation where getting the model 75% of the way there would be a whole heck of a lot better than trying to make the model so perfect that it would then become cumbersome to actually implement?
Absolutely, I agree with that. We see very clearly when we look at the indicators that we've devised, the indicator framework we've devised for measuring progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. There are basic indicators that every country can manage. And then there is a whole slew of other indicators that they should produce and should be able to produce that give you a better sense of what's actually going on in any given area. But then we have what we call third tier indicators, and those are really specialized indicators. And of course, there are a lot of countries that do produce them, but by no means everyone, And so there was a lot of debate a while back on whether, the third tier indicators, these more fine-tuned and specialist types of measurements, should also be a part of the indicator framework that all countries are being expected to produce. And there was a very hefty debate around that. And people were saying, well, how good is good enough? And I think that's an important point, because we have to ask ourselves, what are we measuring something for? Well, I think one of the things we're measuring it for is to inform our choices. And then the question is, well, how precise does our measurement have to be to guide our choices? And sometimes it may be possible to make an informed choice without an absolutely precise indicator. Maybe just a broad indication of where we're heading could be enough to point out when we're heading in the wrong direction. And maybe that's the first step. Get us back on track, and then we can start looking at more precise indicators, perhaps.
Indeed. Well, Mr. Harris, I know that your time is limited. I wish we had another hour together to continue. And perhaps in the not too distant future, we might induce you across the George Washington Bridge to the mysterious land of New Jersey to visit us in person.
I can surely envisage that.
But in the meantime, on behalf of FDU, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us. I'd also like to thank Diana Svitan for organizing our event today, and all of you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.